My name is Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and this is the 2017 Casden Real Estate Economics Forecast with a focus on multifamily housing. Thank you all very much for being here today. I think we have a really nice morning planned for you with really interesting panels, keynoters, etc. First thing I need to do, as a matter of housekeeping though, is acknowledge our sponsors, who are the Heffernan Group, gold sponsor level, Barry Slatt Mortgage, Mack Urban, and NNC Apartment Ventures. So thank you very much to our sponsors for helping make this event possible. And also our program affiliates, the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles and the Building Industry Association of Southern California. So thanks to those organizations for their partnerships. So let's get started and talk about what's happening out there. So first of all, let me just acknowledge the people who made this work happen. First of all, from Beacon Economics, this is the team that did the econometrics that underlies the forecast that I will be showing you eventually. Chris Thornberg, Robert Kleinhans, and Adam Fowler. You're going to be hearing from Chris in about 40 minutes. From our group, the USC Lusk Center, me, Marilyn Ellis in the back there, and Raj Haltermans, our postdoctoral student. And then for data, we used Axiometrics data. We used U.S. Census American Community Survey data, and I'll talk a little bit about how those are connected later. And the other thing, one of my favorite websites is IPUMS. It's a group at the University of Minnesota that basically has done a wonderful job linking data across years so you can compare data from 1990, 2000, 2010, 2015, where the geography is kept constant across time, which is a very painstaking and useful thing to do. And they have the slogan on their website is never used for evil. But the nice thing about it, all you have to do is register with them and you get access to all this stuff for free. I mean, I guess there's the cost of downloading all those electrons, but otherwise it's free. And very useful, and it's going to be the foundation of a number of things I say this morning. Okay, but let's just start by talking about what's happening in housing in general. And we're going to start nationally because there are a lot of things that are happening nationally that apply to California. In fact, they apply in California in many ways more so than they do nationally. But what I want to show you, this is a depiction of housing starts going back to 1960. The blue line is total housing starts, and the red line is single-family housing starts. And one of the things you'll notice, if you sort of squint anyway, right about here is the average number of housing starts we've had per year going back to 1960, which is about 1.4 million. For folks on this side of the room, it's right about here. Okay, that's the average. That's total housing starts. So, and you'll notice these are all-time bottoms before the global financial crisis. We didn't come off this bottom until about 2012. So we had 4 years of housing starts that were at such a low level they were unprecedented since the end of World War II. You have to go back to the Great Depression to see something this bad. And even now, at about 1.2 million, we're still about 16-70% what one would call normal. And you might say, well, you know, we had the baby boom, and so maybe it's just we needed more houses back then. It's true, that was true for a while in the 70s. But in general, no, we should be forming about as many households now as we would have in an average year going back to 1960. Remember, your percentage growth can be smaller, but if it's on a bigger base, you still need the same number, could still need the same number of units. And we're still not at average. And so we have a short supply of housing in the U.S., and that's reflected in the fact that vacancies are pretty low everywhere, other than cities that are shrinking cities. So Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, vacancy rates are not particularly low, but any cities that are sort of experiencing normal growth right now, we're seeing low vacancies by historical standards. And the other thing is, if you look at the single-family side of the market, we're not even close. I mean, we're still sort of at trough levels. on the single-family side for new construction. This gap is multifamily construction, and so that's grown, and that looks bigger, but we're right now at about average, again, for the last 50 years. So it may appear that there's a boom in single-family, when in fact, multifamily, but in fact, what we really have is just normalcy in multifamily right now. And what's particularly deceiving to the eye is here in Los Angeles, as I'll be talking about in a bit, people think, how many think there's a multifamily housing boom in Los Angeles? Okay. Good. Yeah, decent, not some of you. Well, when you drive downtown, it certainly looks like there's a boom because there are a lot of tall buildings that have gone up or are going up. But they're very concentrated. So once you leave downtown LA and a few other places, there isn't a boom. I'm going to come back to that in a bit, as I said. Okay. So why do we have so little construction? And I think this is one of the reasons, and I know you can't read anything on here. That's not the point, to read stuff. The point is to notice there are lots of lines, and this is, this red line reflects where we are relative to the second quarter of 2007, first quarter of 2007 for house prices. This is data from the housing, FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Authority. And the way to look at it is this, is these red bars that are above the axis, those are places where house prices are now higher than they were in 2007, so the peak just before the crash. The other red places, and they're sort of drowned out by the blue, so you'll see prices fell pretty much everywhere. The blue lines is how much prices fell from 2007 to the trough for that city, and you could see they fell everywhere, which is kind of remarkable. But you could kind of pick out within that blue, there's still a bunch of red. See that? And bottom line, nearly half the cities in the US still have not recovered those 2007 peaks. Okay, what does that mean for new housing? Well, new construction is generally not for first-time home buyers. New construction is not generally, quote-unquote, affordable. New construction is for people who have bought their first-time house, have built equity in that house, and then have moved on, okay? Because they have the equity. And I think I have a very typical boomer story. I bought my first house in 1988. As it happens, I bought it for $88,900. So that's coincidental. It was both 88 and 88. I guess the Chinese would say I bought at a lucky price in a lucky year. I should have negotiated 88.8, I guess, on the price. I just sit in my house for 4 years, and it's worth $115,000. So I've built up $27,000 of equity without doing anything, plus a little more because I have some amortization on my mortgage, which allows me to make a down payment on the next house, which is what I did. Actually, it wasn't a new house. It was a lovely old house in the middle of the city where I wanted to live. But the point is, just sitting on equity allowed the first-time home buyer to move up. And this was a very typical story for years and years and years. Well, you have half the cities in the U.S. where you're still not at your peak. In a place like Vegas, now Vegas is an outlier. In Las Vegas, prices are still 30% lower than peak. People not only haven't built equity, they've still lost equity if they bought in 05, 06, 07. And in many cities, even if you built some equity, it's really not very much, not enough to get you to that next house. So on the demand side, one of the issues with new construction is you just don't have lots of people out there with lots of equity to be demanding these houses. On the supply side, of course, the issue is it's becoming harder and harder to build. In California, actually maybe getting slightly easier, but I'll just say slightly, not materially. Nationally, though, it's getting harder and harder. And you sort of have this tension, this political tension between owners and renters. So if you're a homeowner, you don't like new construction, right? If you're a homeowner, you want there to never be another house built again because you want the value to appreciate. If you're a renter, you want the market flooded with housing because if you're a renter, what do you want? You want your rents to fall. And so there are more owners than renters in the U.S., and owners tend to vote at greater numbers than renters. So for those of you who are renters, go vote. And so we have zoning laws, and we have fees, and we have all manner of things that make it more difficult to build. The other thing on the regulatory front, which is particularly important in multifamily space, is financial regulation has made it harder for multifamily developers to get loans. And I don't want to sound like I'm bashing financial regulation because I'm not. I think in general Dodd-Frank has led to the pluses of Dodd-Frank outweigh the minuses in my book, but there are certainly things that could be fixed in it. But the real problem, as far as I could tell, comes from the Basel Accords for lending. And what they basically do is they say to lenders, you have to put aside a certain amount of capital based on how risky your loans are. That's a very sensible thing to do. But for new construction, you have to weight the riskiness of your loan by what's 150% risk weight, which is to say, relative to just a standard business loan, a new construction loan requires a bank to set aside 50% more capital. And banks don't like doing that because that's money that's not being put to work doing something else. And so that seems to be inhibiting. I mean, when I talk to builders, when I talk to lenders, seems to be inhibiting money from going into new construction. And as it happens, when I was working in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, I interacted with the people who were responsible for Basel, and I asked how they came up with the risk weight. And they basically said, well, it sounded like a good number to me. So I think that's a real problem, and it's part of what explains why we don't see as much construction as we otherwise might. Okay, next thing that's going on is there are some countervailing trends that are influencing homeowning, and you think, okay, this is a multifamily conference. Why is he talking about homeowning? Is, of course, if people don't want to own houses as much as they used to, that puts more pressure on the rental market. And to some extent, the rental and the owner market are substitutable for each other. A house is a house, right? You could take a house you own and rent it out to somebody. You could a landlord could take a place they rent and sell it to somebody in principle. But in reality, while the markets are certainly tied to each other, there's some segmentation between the rental and owner market. They're not perfect substitutes for one another. So when you have fewer people owning, you're going to have greater pressure on the rental side of the market. Okay, there are a couple of trends that are working against ownership right now. The first is just people aren't getting married. Married couples, after you control for their age, their income, their race, the city they live in, their education, etc., married couples are 22 percentage points more likely to be owners than singles are. And when I make statements by the way, like that, these are based on regression analysis where you control for a whole lot of stuff. This is where I'm using the IPUMS data. And seeing, okay, what's left over that, say, marital status can explain. And you get this 22 percentage point gap between married couples and pretty much everyone else. What I find a little interesting is, for example, divorced people, their homeownership rate is slightly higher than people who are never married, but it's not that different, whereas there's a big gap between marrieds and singles. Okay, well, what's happening to the marriage rate? If we look at young people, this is according to Pew, if you look at my parents' generation, that's the bar on the left, 65% of them were married by the time they hit age 32. If you look at my generation, it's about 50. If you look at Gen Xers, it's about a third. If you look at millennials, it's about a quarter. So this decrease in marriage has a material impact on housing markets, the kind of housing people are going to want to live in. And if you think about it, it makes sense on a couple of grounds. One is people who aren't married still very often want to get married, which means they want to be mobile. So you're a single person, you're in, let's say, the Los Angeles dating market. After a few years of that, you think, I don't like this dating market very much. I'm going to try the Denver dating market. You don't want to deal with the transactions costs of buying and selling a house, right? And if you're not going to stay in a place for 5 years, you just shouldn't buy because any return you get is going to be eaten up by the transaction cost. So I want the opportunity to move. The second thing is a property management issue, is houses are kind of a pain in the neck to take care of. And by the way, I don't want to sound like I'm picking on homeowning. I am a homeowner. I like being a homeowner. But if something goes wrong as the homeowner, you got to take care of it. When you're a renter, if something goes wrong, if you have a good landlord, the landlord takes care of it. Okay, if you don't have a household where you can divide labor for things like property management, being a renter could very well be a better option than being an owner. And so As a result, you get this lower incidence of owning among millennials or unmarrieds, higher incidence of renting. So one of the big questions for us all who think about this stuff is, are millennials just delaying marriage, or are they never going to get married? And here's one of the most remarkable things about this data to me is if you look at women under the age of 35 who have never been married, it's 19 percentage points higher than it was 20 years ago. That is a very large change in a very short period of time. And the real issue is, will women choose to marry the men who are available to them in the market right now? And there is evidence from an MIT study led by David Otter, who I think is one of the finest labor economists in the country, that suggests the answer might be no. Women are not interested in marrying men who they do not find economically useful. And his experiment for determining this is, if you look at towns, factory towns where a factory shut down, and you look at men without a college diploma, you look at either side of that event, the factory shut down, the marriage rate among those sorts of men plummets, right? Because they don't have the credential necessary to be economically useful. Women are not interested in marrying them. Okay, we're in a world now where women are finishing college at a much higher rate than men are, about 8 percentage points higher, which sort of means, for the men who do have college diplomas, they're in really good shape. But once they're kind of used up, you wonder how many men are going to get married beyond that. And that could depress marriage rates for a long time to come, which could depress homeowning rates. On the other hand, if marriage rebounds, then it's a whole other story. Other thing that's going on, and here's where I find California particularly interesting, I'm going to talk about that in a second, is if you look at how population is changing, nationally between 2010 is the most recent census year, that's why that's picked even though it's 7 years ago now, is the country as a whole is going to grow about 22% over that period of time. Non-Hispanic whites, it's about 6%. Hispanics will more than double. Asians by about 70%. Okay, African Americans about 30%, and other is sort of mixed race, Pacific Islanders, and a few other groups. But this is actually a fairly small number of people. But this is where growth is happening. And so the question you want to ask yourself is, are these groups going to be homeowners or not in terms of looking at demand pressures? Well, again, you could do regression analysis and you could sort of see how much of the gap in homeownership between different races and ethnicities and non-Hispanic whites could just be explained by the economic fundamentals of the households. So, for example, on the far left, here's African Americans. There's a 27% gap in homeownership between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites. 10% of that is socioeconomic factors, so income, marital status, age, education, etc. But there's 17% that's just race. Okay, I'll talk about that, why that might be in a second. If you look at ethnic Mexicans, okay, there more of the gap can be explained by economics and less by ethnicity by itself. But the interesting thing is when you do this particular analysis for Southern California alone, this yellow line for Mexicans goes away. So Mexicans in Southern California, ethnic Mexicans, people of Mexican ancestry, are just as likely to be homeowners as non-Hispanic whites after you control for their observable characteristics. The other thing about Southern California is if you look at the gap for African Americans, it's about half as large as it is for the country as a whole. So California actually is closer to having parity in housing, or at least how many people are owner-occupiers, after you control for the other stuff. Now, let's be honest about this, is if there's wage discrimination, that gets built into the other stuff, and so that's discrimination being part of the gap that's not being explained here. Okay, we're not doing a study of wage discrimination here. But the point is, you saw the groups that are growing. You see this difference in homeowning between other ethnicities and whites. So if these are the groups that are growing, that's going to put downward pressure on homeownership. Now, why do we see these gaps? Well, first of all, there's a nice new paper by Erickson and Bond that shows that the greatest predictor of whether somebody is a homeowner is, believe it or not, whether their parents are a homeowner. So you can look at parents' wealth that's not homeowning wealth, and that has very little to do with whether a kid becomes a homeowner, surprisingly enough. You think rich parents, their kids are going to be a homeowner. Once you control for parents' homeownership status, that tells you a lot about whether the kid becomes a homeowner. And it explains part, but not all of the racial gap. Okay, well, we know, I mean, federal policy discriminated against people of color. The FHA program did. I mean, it explicitly did in previous generations. Thankfully, that's a while ago now, but it's not that long ago. And so that impact is still being felt in the overall market. All right, but there is one other thing that's putting upward pressure on the homeownership rate, and that's the impact of age on the likelihood of homeowning. And again, just the way to think about this is age. This is propensity to be a homeowner, again, after controlling for everything else about the household. And as you could see, just upward slope, as people get older, they're more likely to be homeowners. It's about age 85 that it peaks out, and then it starts to decline. And that, of course, is health that's driving people out of their homes and into very often group quarters situations, nursing homes, congregate care, etc. But the aging of the population has been a buffer against the race impact, the marital impact, and so on, which is why you get the following, I'm going to come back to that in a second. The following finding is, if you look at, take a 1990 model that predicts homeowning based on demographics, based on income, et cetera, and use it to forecast the home ownership rate. What you find is that you would predict a homeownership rate in 2000 of 65.6%. The actual homeownership rate that year is 66.2%, so they're quite close. Remember, 2000 is before the madness really started, so this is really an equilibrium homeownership rate. Where are we now? Well, we're about the same in terms of prediction based on demographics as we were 15 years ago. 2015 is the most recent ACS data. That's why that's listed there. The actual rate is about 2 percentage points lower, and I think that is a function of absence of credit. So if you look at Fannie Mae has better data in their disclosure, so I'm going to refer to that. If you look at Fannie Mae in 2002, again, before things started getting crazy, average LTV was 73%, but their average FICO was 714. Okay, now, the most recent year for Fannie Mae, full year, their LTV was 75%. So you could see down payment has not really changed. People say down payment is the issue. We have we have FHA, we have mortgage insurance. It's, you look at that. That really, in fact, it's gotten a little more generous, a little looser. I'd still not call that loose. But the key thing here is credit. So if you don't have a credit score of 680, you're not getting a Fannie Freddie loan. They'll tell you you can get one, but if you look at the way they do the pricing, you can't. And that, I think, explains a lot of this gap between what we predicted the homeownership rate should be and what it actually is. Okay, so net, that's putting some pressure on the rental market. The one thing that helps, again, a little bit with the rental market and keeps rents from being higher than they otherwise would be, is we are seeing a decline in moving. Again, this goes back to the late 1940s, and if you look at the black line, that's the share of households that move in a year. If you go back to 1948, about 20% of households in the U.S. moved in a year. Now we're at about 12%, 13%. So that is a 40% decline in the rate of moving since the end of World War II. One of the mysteries about this is we have no idea, well, no idea is too strong a statement, but we really don't understand why. We have some inklings why. It's not that the population is changing demographically. So old people move less, young people move less, married people move less, single people move less, Black people move less, white people move less. So it's not that you can sort of decompose how the population is changing and explain this change in moving. And it's fascinating. I have had a number of students of mine, and I have tried to figure out what's going on here by looking at differences in wages, differences in house prices, et cetera, across MSAs. We just can't figure it out. But the fact remains people are moving less. Okay, why does that reduce pressure on rents? Well, renters, stayers, pay lower rents than movers do. Okay, why is that? Well, in California, there are a number of places where stuff built before 1978 is rent controlled, and so that's one reason why. That's not nationally generally true. But the other thing is landlord behavior. I mean, we observe this. This is part of the study we're doing here, is landlords tend to raise rent less on existing tenants than they expect to get in rent from new tenants. And that makes a lot of sense, because you think about it, if you give up 1 month of rent looking for the next tenant, that's like an 8.33% haircut on your revenue for the year. So you think you're in a market and you think, okay, I can get 5% more this year. But I know if I only raise my tenant by 3, they're going to stay. And so I might be willing to take the 2% less in rent growth to avoid the possibility of losing the 1 month. Okay. And as I said, we're seeing this in data. So the less that people move, the less pressure there is on rents observed, which is why the flip side is we see movers pay materially higher rents than stayers do. Okay, so what's going on nationally in terms of affordability? This is a measure that I like to look at, which is median rent to median renter income. The idea here, we're not looking at the share of people's income that they're spending on rent. We're looking at, if you put the median income person in the median unit, how much would they be spending? And the reason for that is, those of you who know me have heard this story a zillion times. I'm sorry about that. But if I decide to buy a house in Malibu, I'm going to spend more than 30% of my income on my housing. Okay? That's not a policy problem. I live in Pasadena. Pasadena is lovely. I could spend a lot less than 30% of my income. Well, now, if I had to buy now, I'm not so sure. But when I bought my house in Pasadena in 2008, I could buy it spending considerably less than 30% of my income on housing. And so given that I have a choice to live in a really beautiful place, if I decide, no, I'm not going to do that, what I'm going to do is not eat out ever again because I want a view of the ocean and spend 40% of my income on my house. That's not a policy problem. So you want to look at what is the opportunity for people in housing? How much do they spend given the opportunity sets available to them? And that's why if I'm putting the median income person in the median rental unit, I am matching them properly. And if 30% is your measure of affordability, if we go back to 2000, in only about 1 in 16 MSAs, these are about 240 MSAs around the country, and only about 1 in 16 do you have an affordability issue, which is, a lot. And Miami is broken into 2 parts for reasons I'm not going to get into. Miami is very expensive, not because the rents are so high. If you were to go there coming from California, you'd say, wow, it's cheap there, but because incomes are so low. But I want you to pay attention to what happens to this graph when I fast forward at 15 years. See how much it rises? And we've now gone from a situation where about 1 in 16 MSAs is unaffordable to one where more than 2 in 3 is unaffordable, if you use that definition. And so this is not a problem unique to California, that housing is expensive. It is particularly expensive here, no doubt about that. Depending on how you look at it, LA may be the most expensive housing market relative to income among any large city in the country. The worst are college towns, but those are, college students have no money and they have to live somewhere. So we tend to dismiss that a little bit. But among big cities, among real cities, LA is probably the most expensive relative to income in the country. But it's a ubiquitous problem now, and it wasn't the case 15 years ago. And so and this is why I think people are so angry, by the way, one of several reasons, is this is how much the median income person has left over after they pay their median rent. The change over the last 15 years, and you could see that it's gone, there are a few places, Gadsden, Alabama, I don't know what's going on there, but there things are pretty sweet. You're making a lot more money than you're paying in extra rent. But, 95% of American cities, the median renter in the median rental unit has less money left over at the end of the month. And that may explain why people are so frustrated right now. Even if their incomes are going up, if they have less left over, they're not going to be happy people. All right. What's happening in LA? Oops. There we go. All right. Let's go through our markets. And the way I did this is, I basically randomized the markets, so I just want you to show the Lusk Center loves all of these markets equally. The order reflects nothing about who we like best and who we like least. That's why I used a random number generator to pick the order that we're going through in terms of the markets here. And we're going to look at vacancy rate, we're going to look at rent, and we're going to look at new construction. And here in the Inland Empire, as you can see, we expect vacancies to continue to fall. Okay, Inland Empire, and I will give it up to Chris Thornberg, who's left the room for a minute. I hope he comes back soon. Chris was saying 4 or 5 years ago that the Inland Empire was going to come roaring back, and I said, no way, no how, but it has. So you have substantial job growth, good income growth, and not enough stuff being built, and so we expect rents to rise there. Not at quite the pace that we had a few years back, but still at a healthy pace. There is at least some multifamily activity. Key here is, this is 2016 year to date. This is the whole year, but to compare what's happening this year to last, okay, we are seeing a pretty good uptick in multifamily permit activity in the Inland Empire, but I got to tell you, 2,000 is really not enough to absorb the new demand, and that's why we expect vacancies to fall and rents to rise. Okay, if you look at LA, again, this is actually the most robust building market, and I have to, I want to give some props to the city of LA for a second here. So if you look at new construction in the region, there's lots of reason to complain about the city of LA, and I'll let you, do your own grumbling about what's wrong with the city of LA, particularly with respect to real estate. But if you look at where stuff is getting built in the region, it's being built in the city of LA. If you look at things like building permits per capita, the city of LA is not remotely the problem. It could still do better. Mayor Garcetti is out there somewhere. We can do better. But compared to the region, the city of LA is doing better. Okay? And so we expect rents to increase, but not by quite as much as some of our other places. That's a material increase. But again, you could see we've had, pretty good run-up in multifamily building activity, 15 strong. It's showing up now if you drive around downtown LA. 2016, not quite so much, but not too bad. And we're running a little ahead this year of where we were a year ago at this time. The problem is really not, well, it is. LA is still a problem. It's just less of a problem in terms of what's going on. Here's Ventura County. Vacancy we expect to stay fairly flat. Rents we expect to rise. But here, if you look at new building activity in Ventura, it popped up nicely in 2016, but it's not keeping up that pace. And if you look at, again, this is actually a pretty small number of units relative to the size of the county, which is not quite 1 million people. That's not a whole lot of new units, and it's trending downward. And then Orange County, again, vacancies falling, rents rising. And again, we look at permit activity in Orange County, it is down considerably from where it was a year ago. So when I say LA is doing better, I'm looking at you, OC, you got to do better in terms of building stuff. In San Diego, again, very similar story, pretty flat vacancy, slight uptick in rent. Some new construction last year, but again, down from where it was a year ago. And so that's why we expect, there not to be enough supply and rent to increase. Now, the last thing I want to mention about this is, how would you know the point at which rents will stop rising, which is something I'm guessing people in this room would be interested in knowing. And you want to look at, if the vacancy rate starts to hit about 5%, that's roughly the point at which we expect rents to flatten out. And so why is 5%? So why is it you can get any rent increase at all with any vacancy at all? You're thinking, well, there's vacancy, there's excess capacity in the housing market. That's not true. Because you have turnover is a normal part of a well-functioning housing market. The average renter stays in their house for 2 years. So that means normal marketing is one renter moves out, you market the property, you paint it, you put in a new stove or a new refrigerator, you trim the hedges, you get the next person in. There'll be a month of vacancy between the old renter and the new renter, as I said. Okay, that's 1 in 24 months. If all is going well, you can expect there to be vacancy. So that's a little more than 4% of the time. So you start with that, and then add about another 1 for what we call mismatch in the market. So it's, for example, you have a lot of people want 1-bedroom apartments and there are a bunch of 3-bedrooms. Or you have a lot of people who want 3-bedroom apartments and there are a bunch of 1-bedrooms. You don't have quite the right product for the type. And that's why you don't get down to 0. Just like the unemployment rate never gets down to 0. And so if you see vacancies creeping up past about 5%, that's the point at which you should know it's going to be tougher to raise your rents if you're looking to do that. But we're still well under 5 in all of the markets we're looking at, even the inland, well, not well under 5, but under 5 in the Inland Empire. The only place really as tight as Southern California is New York City in terms of vacancies. Even that's starting to loosen just a little bit. And so, of course, all forecasts are wrong. So pay attention to what's going on out there. As things change, these numbers will change too. And thank you for your kind attention. And now we will have our first panel of the morning.
We've been talking about an affordability crisis for years now in Southern California and throughout the nation. And the forecast shows that rent growth has slowed down. Do we feel that we might be starting to turn a corner? Or is the affordability crisis as bad as it ever was?
Well, we just got some new data from the American Community Survey, and it shows actually in 2016, the share of renters fell pretty sharply. In fact, it's been on a downward trend for the last couple of years, but 15 to 16 was the biggest drop we saw. That's true in the nation. It was particularly true here in California, which I know seems completely different than what you'll hear from a lot of our policymakers. It's interesting to note that in the state of California, we seem to be in a complete panic now about housing, when in many ways 3 years ago the problem was worse than it is today, given some of these broader metrics of distress within the system. It isn't to say things are good. Lack of affordable housing is here in the region is some of the worst in the nation. But we're actually trending in a better direction. A lot of folks will ask why that is, and of course it goes to the fact that our broader economy, and specifically our labor markets, have really turned a corner in the last couple of years. I like to say that 3 years ago we had too many workers and not enough housing. Today we have not enough workers and not enough housing. And as a result of both labor shortage, you'll see rising wages, and that's what actually leading to some of the reduction in burdens.
So that's interesting. We're still not seeing as much building as we would like, and now we've got rent growth slowing down. There's a statistic in the report from Laurie Goodman at the Urban Institute saying that we come about 300,000 units short of supply meeting demand every year, and so now we're about 3 million short in total after the last decade. And so maybe a question for you, Paul, is do you think that we're ever going to catch up where supply meets the demand, or is this the new normal where we're always going to have that kind of gap with the problems that we have in California?
I think that part of it has to do with the location of the job growth and the jobs that are allowing people to pay either the kind of rents we're talking about or being able to afford a home. So I think in the urban areas, no, I don't think you're ever going to see a catch-up of any materiality.
Can you, from a lender's standpoint, are these trends starting to show up in what you're seeing in the debt markets? Is it changing how people are underwriting projects at all?
Well, yeah, I think everyone's felt the pullback from banks on construction financing in the market, and that's been a function of a lot of factors. There's regulatory pressure. There's the simple fact that the cost to build has gotten so high, rents are flattening out. It's hard to make those deals underwrite at the leverage levels that banks are willing to give. And there's also some alternative sources of financing out there that didn't exist probably in the way they did last cycle that are picking up some of what the traditional banks aren't doing. But I think the bankers, the recession isn't so far, we don't remember how bad it was, and so it feels like it's time for a correction. The indicators don't point to one, but no one wants to be caught when the music stops because they weren't prepared for it. So I think everyone's taking a cautious approach, and there is some lending happening, but it's very selective. It's taking longer to get deals done, and that's just kind of constricting the market.
So since you mentioned that some people think it's time for a correction, I'll just throw that question open to the panel and see who wants to dare responding to that.
Well, I think fundamentals are good right now. People have jobs. As Chris pointed out, incomes are rising finally, which is kind of a wonderful thing. In fact, I have to tell a brief story. When I was proofing the report, the Beacon guys had a number for income growth in Orange County of nearly 10% in a year. And I said, that can't possibly be right. 10% in 1 year, but it was right. So, I mean, things are better. There's just no way around it. And you sort of look at, is the U.S. competitive at what it does? Yes. Do we have great companies? Yes. Do we still have the benefits of being transparent? That, for example, you buy stock in one of our companies, can you read the financials and know what you're getting relative to the rest of the world? Yes, that's all still true. What does concern me, though, is some existential event that we can't even imagine, or maybe that we just had, and I'll talk about that in a second, knocking us off kilter, a crisis. So, for example, the twin hurricanes in Florida and Texas, I don't think we really understand yet what the impacts of those will be. Now, a couple of things. First of all, there's a story that it will increase GDP because you'll have to have all these people doing new construction. And there's some truth to that, but this is why, in a sense, GDP is a bad number. It's gross domestic product. What that means is you don't take into account depreciation. Think about how much depreciation happens when you lose 300,000 houses. That's a whole lot of depreciation gone at once. Okay, just because it doesn't show up in the top line GDP number doesn't mean that isn't a real thing that happened. People are going to, even if they're insured, they're going to have to spend money on just replacing their house that they're not spending on something else. The more important thing is for the financial system is we're still not clear to the point where people are going to default on their loans because their houses were flooded or blown down. You have to be 90 days out. And I wish I could say with confidence that we had the sort of people in charge of housing finance right now, that they would know what to do to make sure that we didn't create a crisis unnecessarily by allowing lots of loans to go into default as opposed to exercising forbearance. If they do make those calls correctly, then I think it'll be, in terms of the economy, a fairly minor event. But if you make those calls incorrectly, you could suddenly put a lot of pressure on financial institutions that do business in those particular states. And we know that there are cascading effects once you start having problems with finance. And so I'm not predicting a problem, but I am worried that something is going to happen out there that could create a problem.
There are still a lot of things we don't understand about how financial shocks like that propagate across the system. Do you think that a shock that's just regional like that to just Texas and Florida, if there's a lot of leverage involved, that through the financial system it could actually hurt our economy over here in a noticeable way?
No.
You don't? All right, take it. Then we'll come back to Kenya.
I agree with him, but yeah.
Financial markets don't create recessions. Never have, never will. And it's a mistake to think that the Great Recession was caused by the financial markets or the dot-com crash was caused by, the collapse of NASDAQ. That's completely getting it backwards. Recessions are created by real imbalances or real shocks to the economy. If you want to talk about what happened in the Great Recession, it wasn't because home prices fell. It's because people were vastly overspending and then they had to rein in their spending. It's because we were vastly overbuilding homes and then we had to pull in spending on homes. It's the real imbalances in the economy you have to worry about. And to what we're talking about before, look across the real economy today. We're not overbuilding, we're not overspending, we're not overinvesting. We live in a, like it or not, kind of a milquetoast economy right now. It's not too hot, not too cold. And as a result of that, short of some really unexpected shock to the system, there's no reason to think that this expansion is going to continue. And candidly, a few foreclosures, a drop in the stock market, all become relatively irrelevant in the context of that kind of system.
Does everyone agree with that?
You know, I would say that you could perhaps argue that the porridge isn't exactly the right temperature right now. And clearly there's a lot of stress on the cost side, which I think is what we were talking about earlier relative to yields. You know, we haven't seen the wage growth that we've seen comparatively to the pressure that's exerted either through land values being overheated or you know, construction costs being overheated.
I don't think land values are overheated at all. I mean, look, if you look across the United States today, once you account for real incomes, not the fake stuff you get off the census webpage, but actual incomes, which include all sorts of income.
You got your data from the census, right? I'm just joking.
No, I get a lot of it from the census, but you know, we're constantly tossing around this statistic that Americans haven't seen a raise in 20 years.
No, I didn't say that.
But fair enough, but that's a number that's bandied about on the basis of this data on household income you get off the census webpage. And the problem is that's based on IRS records, which are an extremely poor level measure of incomes. If you look at actual numbers, have been going up. So once you count for real incomes, you count for low interest rates, not only is housing more affordable today by a good shot than it was in 2005, it's more affordable today than it was in 1998. Housing in the United States today is at a record level of affordability because of these incredibly low interest rates.
Just you're saying owner housing.
Single family.
Owner housing.
Yeah, owner housing.
Yeah, but that's maybe on average, but in pockets we're talking like in Los Angeles specifically, you can't argue the cost of land has not impacted valuations. I mean, it makes the deals, construction deals, very hard to pencil when you're paying $250 a unit for a piece of land and you get a build for $400,000. You've got to bank on 5% rent growth during your construction period to make that thing get a 6 return on your deal.
I'm not arguing.
I mean, it's just that is a factor, maybe not on average nationally, but in a local kind of microeconomy, it definitely is.
Sure. All the dense core urban areas in the United States are expensive like that. San Francisco, LA, Washington, D.C., New York. I mean, you have very similar issues. That's a kind of a standard part of the process.
Well, can I just follow up on that point is I think something that does worry me is when people say we can build our way out of this problem. Now, I think new construction is really important, and I am a big advocate for making it easier to build stuff. Sometimes to the annoyance of my wife, because I think like the street near our house should be rezoned to allow for more multifamily on it. And she looks at me like I'm crazy, but I said, well, I can't say I'm against upzoning because I say constantly in my neighborhood, because I'm constantly advocating upzoning. But that said, one thing that every great city in the world has in common is very expensive housing. London, it's expensive. Singapore, it's expensive. New York, it's expensive. LA, it's expensive. Sydney, it's expensive, and so on. And to some extent, that's because housing is the governor to keep these places from having like 50 million people in them. Is you open up housing, more people are going to want to come. You're giving the opportunity for more people to come. And I think in general, that's a good thing. But I don't think you're ever going to get ahead of it. And the reason I say that, I look at a place like Singapore, where they build like crazy. And they still have housing that the owner stuff sells, and the market rate owner stuff sells for $2,000 a square foot. Because Singapore is, an economic powerhouse. It's beautiful. It's, I wouldn't want to live under that government personally. But there are a lot of people who don't mind that, and so they want to be there. And so what Singapore decided to do a long time ago is they just provide subsidies to a whole lot of people. Something like 80% of people in Singapore get a housing subsidy. In Hong Kong, it's about half get a housing subsidy. And so I think there needs to be recognition that, well, yes, we must build more. And in many cities, in Salt Lake City, building will solve the problem. Denver, building will solve the problem. In these sort of great global cities, building by itself is not going to solve the problem.
It reminds me of, one of the things that always makes me crazy is when they have those places ranked books, where they rank all the cities, and in there they'll have like quality of school and crime rates, and then they'll have home prices, and I mean that's ridiculous. To Richard's point, you want to know places ranked, just take home prices and sort them highest to lowest. There you go.
That's pretty close to right.
Because the places that are most expensive, the places that people want to be. That's why they are the most expensive. Now, we have, of course, created additional burden with all the rules and regulations and costs of things. But, you know, I think one of the things I think we have to have a conversation about as an economy here in Los Angeles is we're constantly wringing our hands and screaming that this is a crisis. Well, yes and no. I mean, there are plenty of people out there who, you know, I get off stage and they'll look right at me and they'll say, I don't want more housing. I don't care. I'm fine with the current
Well, that's
system.
what I said. So owners don't want us to build any more, and renters
they don't
want us to build lots more.
Right. So, you know, it is, if you think that Los Angeles and these dense urban corridors should be available for everybody, then then the mission is to build more housing. If you don't, and there are plenty of people who feel that way, then the answer is not. And the economy will find an equilibrium in either case. We will find a way forward. It'll just be a different kind of picture.
I think the issue is what that equilibrium will look like, right? I mean, one of the studies that Richard and I have seen, and you've probably seen too, coming out of urban economics from Enrico Moretti, and it's been covered in the New York Times and everything, is showing that by preventing so many people from coming to places like Los Angeles, where home prices are high, but also where productivity is high and job growth is high, they stay in places with lower productivity, and it actually winds up hurting the overall economy. GDP is less than it could have been. I don't know if that's right, but that's one argument.
Well, if Moretti said it, probably isn't right.
Oh, stop it.
The guy is
deep analytical counter.
Well, he's far fonder of catchy headlines than realistic, discussions about the economy. Just moving somebody from the middle of Iowa to L.A. doesn't make them more productive. And to say that out loud is crazy. I mean, cause and effect here. Are we seeing higher productivity in Los Angeles because we have, if you will, filtered growth into the city on the basis of our limited housing supply? I don't know what's cause and effect, and that kind of glib response to that statistic doesn't have any degree of
Look, I think that you can't disregard the correlation between the quality of the jobs in certain cities versus the quality of the jobs in others. I mean, if you look at, the cities, Austin, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, you look at those jobs, what they're paying versus jobs in other MSAs. I mean, clearly there's a desire on certain people's parts to be in those MSAs versus others.
Oh, I would agree with that, but again, cause and effect. The question is, do we not see low-end jobs in Los Angeles because low-end jobs can't afford to be in Los Angeles?
But one of the things is, Jung Choi at USC and I have a new paper which redoes the Moretti, only we think we do it better. But what we find is Moretti is right.
Low bar.
So we use panel data, so we're actually following people. And we find that when people, to Chris's point, do move from Iowa to San Francisco, they do better, even taking into account the difference in the cost of housing. So, no, there are spillover. If you move to a city with a greater share of college-educated people, you will do better than the city you left behind. And again, I think this is actually one of the reasons, again, that people are so upset. I mean, I showed you the rent thing, but the other thing is our cities are becoming more unequal. There are absolutely winner cities and loser cities. Right. So think about what's going on here. We'll just, because Chris mentioned Iowa and Chris doesn't mind people being upset with him, I will just stick with Iowa. The person who leaves Davenport, Iowa for San Jose, both enriches San Jose and leaves Davenport poorer, right? Because who are the people who move? That's the other thing. They are people who tend to be more entrepreneurial in a sense. They're willing to leave family. They're willing to leave what's familiar in order to take advantage of opportunity. And we still haven't really sussed that out entirely. That's really hard to do. But that's why we think at least following movers and stayers helps with that. But so you have San Francisco gaining, or San Jose gaining, that person who really wants to be there, and that ambitious person is leaving Davenport. And so this sort of gap between cities is getting larger and larger. And I think this is probably an unhealthy development, but I have no idea how you would do anything about that.
I have looked at some of the data, looking at income growth by counties, by sizes, and actually I find the idea that large cities are doing great and everybody else is not doing well, that's not held up by the data. There's plenty of small economies that are doing very well out there with rapid...
Well, yeah, like Madison, Wisconsin, and Lincoln, Nebraska.
Yeah.
So
And
college
there's a whole
towns.
bunch of places in Texas as well that are doing fantastic. So it's not that simple. It's not that clean. Yes, some urban areas are doing better. So this goes back to this idea that we have, in many ways, convinced ourselves of a lot of facts that just aren't true. And one of those facts is that small town America is falling way behind, and big town America is not. And again, the data doesn't hold that up. There are plenty of small cities across the United States that are doing great.
So let me push on that a little bit, because I think it comes back to something that Kenya was talking about, which is that it's not, all one country experiencing the same thing. There are different pockets, right? And this may explain some of why, Richard, you were so surprised to see 10% income growth. I was surprised to see the income growth in Southern California in this report. And I'm wondering, is that a function of just the national numbers we've been hearing or bad data? Or is it the fact that Southern California is doing that much better than the average of the rest of the country?
We are doing somewhat better. For the last couple of years, we've been going gangbusters. But one of the reasons you're seeing incomes rise right now is in large part, again, because we've run out of workers. From my sort of broader policy perspective, we live in, I guess you could say scientifically, bizarro land, where the conversations coming out of D.C. are so diametrically opposed to reality on the ground. For example, one of the constant every time Trump gets up and announces anything from taxes to healthcare, he says, well, we need jobs, we're bringing jobs back to the United States. We don't have a job shortage in the United States. We have a worker shortage. Unemployment rates are as low as they've been. The job openings rate is at an all-time high level. We have a shortage of workers, not a shortage of jobs in this nation.
Skilled workers.
No, actually not. That's my point. Over the last year, the American Community Survey, the biggest gains, percentage-wise, we've seen in incomes were for low-skilled workers. And that is particularly true, even more so in Southern California. I'm talking about gains. Yeah. They're still far behind, obviously. But in terms of income growth over the last year, people without a high school degree saw the biggest gains in income in California, in the nation, over the last year. Talk to anybody, and they will tell you hotels and restaurants are having as bad of a time filling positions as your tech companies are, because there are simply not enough low-skilled workers to fill the available positions at this point in time. The pendulum has truly shifted in a way that this is not the economy we were in 3 years ago. We're in a completely different space with completely different dynamics, and candidly, the dynamics we're seeing today is fantastic for workers of all skill levels. Again, that old model we need to push away, because that is not where our economy is right now.
But
go ahead.
But to your question, Richard, haven't you said in the work you've done that there's certain cities and places in this country where if you started out poor, the opportunity to get to the higher income class is much easier in certain parts of the country?
Yeah, that's actually Raj Chetty's work, not as much as I would like to claim it. But yes, I've cited Raj Chetty on this.
California is one of those states where if you...
It's an opportunity place,
so you can have the more American dream in California. Statistically speaking, you can come from poverty and raise yourself to wealth much easier than other parts of the country. So I do think, I don't know what that dynamic is about the state, but that element does exist. There are places where it's easier to advance yourself, right? Maybe it's...
I've actually found it interesting. So two of the best opportunities, so the idea is if you're born in the lowest fifth, what's the probability that you wind up in the top fifth? That's the measurement. The Bay Area does fantastically well on that. Another place that does fantastically well is Salt Lake City, Utah. And so Utah, other than the fact that you have two very well-educated cities, so that's maybe, again, a spillover effect, the differences between Salt Lake City and the Bay Area are pretty profound. Nevertheless, those are opportunity places. The worst places tend to be in the Deep South, where if you're born in the bottom 20, you're staying in the bottom 20. You're just not rising up. Now, what are the elements that lead to these differences? I mean, again, I would maintain, and this is correlation, not causation, unlike... So the paper we did before, we actually were following people so we could control for what we call their unobserved characteristics. But it is certainly true, better educated cities seem to be higher opportunity cities than more poorly educated cities. But I wouldn't want to attribute cause.
How stable do we expect that to be over time? I mean, if we're looking 10, 15 years down the road and we want to bet on the housing markets that are going to provide the most opportunities to people, that are going to have the most educated workers, do we expect that they're going to be the same places that they were over the last 30 years?
Well, it's certainly changed over the last 30 years. I don't think 30 years ago you would have necessarily seen Texas cities as great engines of economic, maybe 40 is more like it. And now, Houston, for all of its very real problems right now, is one of the most dynamic local economies in the country. It's very diverse. It's dependent on energy still, absolutely, but nowhere near as singly dependent as it was 30, 40 years ago. It's went from a poorly educated city to a well-educated city. So Houston, I would give as an example of a place that 40 years ago you would not have looked at as a place of great opportunity, and now it is. The flip side, and again, it may not be 30, that may be too short a period of time, but I'm thinking if you go back 50 years, Rochester, Minnesota is still good. Rochester, New York was considered one of the great innovator cities in the country. It was Xerox, it was Eastman Kodak. I would imagine that if you went back to the early 60s and asked people, how's Rochester going to do in the next 20 years, people would say, oh, it's going to be swell, because look at these great companies.
By the way, I'm from Rochester, if you're wondering where he is.
With jobs.
Yeah, it depends on jobs, right?
There's so much of this trying to look forward 15, 20 years, I think, has to do with who the employers are, what those industries are, and what kind of talent are they attracting. And where do people want to work for Principal in Des Moines? Yeah. Not that nothing's wrong with Principal or working in Des Moines, or would they rather try to work for Google in San Jose?
And look whatever Amazon picks as their secondary headquarters will transform that city for the next 30 years, right? They will single-handedly revive a community or bolster one, because income, jobs, everything, they'll bring the whole infrastructure in the process. So jobs, you got to follow the jobs in the industries, and where they're hiring, you should expect to see, fairly rapid change in those economies.
I was going to say, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to be the contrarian on stage today. I don't buy that. I really don't. I think, look, Amazon said when they're looking for this place called second headquarters, one of the things they said is, we want a young, educated, available workforce. I mean, they're looking for places where they can actually build a business, rather than I'm going to build here and expect people to come to me. In fact, one of the defining features of our economy today over the last couple of years, because labor markets have returned to normal, because there are opportunity, you are starting to see the mass migrations reappear. Remember that? Over a decade ago, there was big talks about the fact that people were leaving the Northeast and the Midwest, and they're heading south to the Southeast, they're heading to the Southwest, and that is back in full force in the U.S. today. And we were running some statistics off the 2016 numbers that I thought were fascinating. When we looked at growth of young workers, looked at growth of 25 to 54-year-olds, 25 to 45-year-olds, that kind of young group. And again, you look in the Midwest and the Northeast, nothing. That whole demographic is leaving. You're actually seeing declines in the number of young workers in those markets, to those markets' detriments. Wisconsin, since we're throwing barbs at each other's hometown, Wisconsin has one of the tightest labor markets in the country, has one of the highest participation rates, one of the lowest unemployment rates, and it's not because they have a lot of big employers, it's because people leave.
Yeah. So why did you leave Rochester and come to LA?
Because UCLA made me a nice offer.
And why did you stay? It wasn't because the opportunities were better here?
No, it's because I love it here.
Yeah.
I love California. I mean, I every day, no matter how bad the traffic is, bad it was coming down here this morning, I opened the window and I looked at that sky and I went, wow, am I lucky.
And you think that's why most people are here?
I think a lot of people want to be here because this is a fantastic place to live. And yes, I think that people are making that. The statistics bear it out. For whatever reason, people are moving. Now, we're not seeing a lot of people move here because we won't make housing available to them. But the places that are booming, places like, look at Denver.
Yeah.
Denver's crazy. Seattle, crazy. Portland, crazy.
I don't think anybody's going to Seattle for the weather, but...
Well, actually, I disagree with that.
Look what happened to Austin in this current cycle, right? I mean, the seeds of an educated population were there, a desirable city, and then maybe because of those fundamentals, tech decided to make it a back office for a lot of its business. And the population essentially doubled in the past 8 to 10 years. The housing stock has gone up exponentially. I mean, yes, the seeds have to be there, but once it's planted, it tracks and it grows. And so I think that these markets, I still do think the jobs have a lot to do with it, because that's the base, but you're still bringing in mass migration to fill these roles, to build these companies out and to serve the needs of the economy that they're kind of developing.
And I think we could have a 2-hour debate on what Amazon's doing right now.
Paul, I want to follow up on something you said a little bit ago, which is when Chris was talking, you emphasized skilled workers.
Right.
And I'm wondering if part of that is because of what you're seeing in construction.
Well, I mean, I think it's what we're seeing as costs continue to escalate. Obviously, a smaller portion of the population can afford to pay whatever the freight is for that particular opportunity. And I mean, you're right. I mean, there's been an increase in service workers or service working related jobs, for example, in the greater Los Angeles area, but can those people on their own afford to live in a new apartment building or a starter home? It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
It's pretty tough.
One of the things I'm wondering is, from the supply side, though, how much of the rise in costs is construction costs, lack of shortage of skilled workers versus land costs, regulation costs?
Well, on average, you could argue in this MSA, land is between 10 and 15% of the overall cost. So if land doubles, it starts to push up on that 15%, along with construction escalating at, 4% annually, perhaps, in the last 4 years. And clearly, I think we're to the point now where there is a shortage relative to just the capacity that there exists, given the outward migration we saw after the Great Recession, where so many folks left.
Yeah.
Skilled construction workers.
But so one thing I'm curious about, though, Paul, is you had a lot of these people leave for like North Dakota.
Right.
Those jobs are not in North Dakota anymore. Are they starting to come back? I mean, they seemed footloose enough to leave to find where the construction work was. Are you seeing? And again, the energy sector, there's been a lot of layoffs.
Right.
Has any of that returned?
I don't know.
Actually, energy is, believe it or not, actually the number of wells going in, investment, employment in the sector has actually recovered.
Oh, all right.
And so it's as shocking as it is. If you had told an oil person, and we're totally off topic here, if you told an oil person 20 years ago that at $50 a barrel they're going to be putting more holes in the ground, they would have laughed you out of the room. And that's exactly what's happening right now. It's a brave new world in the energy sector, and those economies are moving forward still. But look, one of the mysteries about the construction job thing for me is, well, wait a minute, construction jobs are nowhere near where we were in 2005. What happened to all these people in the last 10 years? Mm-hmm. I mean, did they leave the sector completely? Are they doing other things? Did they leave the nation? That's possible too. I don't know. I've heard about these labor shortages. Again, to me, it seems it's odd because the jobs are nowhere near what we were in 2005.
There is net out migration to Mexico right now.
That could be a big part of it.
So if we build a wall, it's going to slow down people leaving and not people coming. So
build a wall to keep them in.
Keep them in. Interesting.
It's well, anyway, but in terms of people disappearing, I mean, one of the things if you look at the population estimates, as a country, we're growing much less rapidly than we have customarily grown. We're probably going to grow over this decade about 7-8%. The last decade was the first decade in a long time we didn't grow at least 10%. It was like 9, something like that. More people are leaving than coming, and that is not net, because we have a lot of immigration from Asia and from Central America still. But still, people aren't getting married, people aren't having kids, and fewer people are coming. And some people are going. And so that may explain part of where these workers are going.
And it is reflected. I mean, I think if you talk to people who are in the business of delivering single-family homes or multifamily, and you look back over the last 2 years, I mean, have all your deliveries been on time? Of course not. I mean, most infill projects have experienced significant delays in completion, which increases cost because there haven't been the people there like there was perhaps 4 or 5 years ago to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They're just not going to do it.
Can I ask the audience a quick question along these lines? How many of you folks have had done a remodel in your home in the last year or two of some sort or another? Okay, how many of you...
On budget and on time, right?
Yeah, keep your hands up if you've had it done. How many of it found it really easy to find contractors to do your drywall or your electric or whatever? Okay, I want to know who you two are.
Thanks to my house.
No, it was very straight. So it's just a story, but you know, sometimes if you get a lot of people confirming the story, stories turn into data.
Yeah.
You know, we have an old house and we had an interior pipe burst, and you know, we needed to basically redo our downstairs. And man alive, it was hard getting people out just to do a bid. And you're thinking, you know, we're willing to pay you money now, and it took us 4 or 5 months to get the contractor out and to get the work done. And I was wondering whether that reflected something going on. I think it probably did.
And it clearly, it impacts cost.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you know, I can tell you from firsthand experience, deliver 300 units 4 months late, it's $2 million of added cost.
Mm-hmm. Every project I've financed in the past 4 years, except like 1 or 2, delivered between 4 months and a year late.
Well, there you go. Okay.
I mean,
So there have been some new reports looking back at data over the past 50, 100 years and showing that the construction industry is the one outlier in the economy in terms of not increasing productivity like other industries. In fact,
actually, lack of productivity growth is inflicting almost every industry in the United States over the last 5 years.
Okay.
That's another one of those little conundrums that economists keep trying to figure out.
But Anthony's point about the last 50.
This is over the long term. I agree with what you're saying since the Great Recession. But the question is, has the construction industry not been keeping up with new technologies or not coming up with new ways to save on overhead, or what's going on? Why is it so hard to build?
I would argue that, again, in larger infill transactions post-Great Recession, there's been advancements made in building systems relative to prefabrication, things like that.
Yeah. Do you see prefabrication being a growing trend over the coming decades?
Well,
to deal with that?
There's a group here in the West who's really trying to, they're in Seattle and San Francisco, who are really, it's been tried and it's failed, you know, a number of times, but it's back in vogue now in trying to figure it out. But I don't know.
Yeah. So I want to turn to other cost factors, and specifically now I'm thinking of state and local policies. Regulation always has to come up in this conversation. We know that it's hard to build in Southern California, but let's start with the status quo and then we'll talk about how things may or may not change. What, in your mind, are the biggest things that make it hard to build? If you were talking to policymakers, what would be the lever, if you could have your wish, that you would ask them to pull?
Sure. Well, and I sit in a back seat to my developers who I build, you know, I finance, but we see a whole array of issues that come up on various deals. So I think the thing that hasn't quite been accounted for is there was a fairly well-known case in Los Angeles about a property that was fully constructed and based on a technicality and its entitlements lost its building permits. So the fact that the city, as the one who issues building permits and allows for development, your entitlements aren't guaranteed even upon your completion, I think added another layer of risk to the development process and kind of unquantifiable cost that hasn't quite been, I think, felt all the way through the system yet. But I think from a policy standpoint, I think that the developers who are spending 2 to 10 years to get entitlements, millions and millions of dollars, and to that, once you get those entitlements, there should be some protection that they are then valid and can't be challenged. that far into the process. And then to have it happen in the city to kind of, I don't know, I don't want to get too far into that, but it was interesting to watch that happen because entitlements are already hard enough. It takes so much time. There's between CEQA and, you know, environmental impacts and all the things you have to kind of go through. I think that entitlements, you have to be a deep-pocketed investor because if you're a small guy trying to start out, you don't have the money to take the risk. And it's you know, removing an element of that community that we need to kind of build that next developer up. And so I think there needs to be more protections for entitlements once you've gone through all those processes. I think that from, you know, anecdotally being a citizen in Los Angeles and being a homeowner, I think our neighborhood communities have a little bit too much influence on stuff. I think the fact that one person can hold up an entire development, I'm not sure that's necessarily the best outcome for the neighborhood as a whole, the community as a whole, but that's just more anecdotal in my opinion.
Well, you know, I have to say, before I moved to California, I thought entitlements meant Social Security and Medicare. Where I lived, so in Madison, Wisconsin, which is, you know, small potatoes, town of about 250,000 people, very environmentally oriented community, as you might expect, given that it's a college town. But they had this thing called zoning. And the zoning was tough. I mean, and I'm sure there are developers who complained about it because you had to do certain things to build certain things, but it was all written in the zoning text. But basically, if you took plans to the people who gave you a building permit and showed that it met the bulk and use requirements of the zoning, you were issued a permit and that was it. No matter how big the project was, you could build a 120-unit apartment building, which in Madison is a really big project. If it conformed to zoning, you took your plans in, and that was it. You got it. And so so even though it wasn't Houston, right? There were requirements that you had to fulfill to be a developer. They were very well-known, very straightforward, very predictable, and you didn't have to go through any kind of legislative process in order to get permission to build. It was only if you wanted to change the zoning, and that was a big deal. Now, the other thing about Madison is, well, it was sort of like San Diego more recently, is they actually update their zoning plans on a fairly regular basis. So the zoning of the town sort of reflects what the market demands in the town are. And so you don't have to ask for relief from zoning if the zoning actually reflects what's happening in your town. And so one of the other things I think that's happening here, besides the fact that we have this thing called entitlements risk that I didn't even know existed till I moved here, we also have zoning that's, of course, so out of date that people have to ask for rezonings or exceptions from zonings to get anything done.
I think, though, that, you know, earlier you spoke about the city of Los Angeles
being better,
doing an adequate job and having improved since, say, 10 or 15 years ago. I think that's absolutely correct. It has dramatically. On the other hand, I think in a world that we live in today, where sort of everybody knows what everybody's doing in any MSA and all this information is free, we've got to do a better job when you've got an uncompleted Target store sitting in Hollywood now for how many, 4 years? Mm-hmm. Everybody in the country knows about this. And the city, I think the industry, the city, we've got to do a better job because there's no question that impacts the availability of capital coming into this MSA for the people who want to execute on business plans here. I mean, there's a tendency for capital to remember. I think it's the only uncompleted Target store in the history of Target. I mean, and it happens to be in Los Angeles, and it's been sitting there for 4 years now. I mean, this is not a good thing.
No.
Well, but again, give us a little credit. We're finishing up the biggest building west of the Mississippi down the street here, and that went off without a hitch. So it's not like we're not deploying capital.
But how long did it
Very
take
different
to
neighborhood council, too.
And how long did it take to get entitled?
Yeah. But I'm just saying that there have been a lot of notable successes recently as well.
But Chris, I have to say,
just don't underestimate how smart capital is today and how competitive it is. Don't underestimate.
I think I've read somewhere, don't quote me exactly, the average entitlement to get entitlements or permits for a building nationally is like 8 months. In Los Angeles, it's like 2.8 or 3 years, right? The cost of additional cost of capital you have to expend to develop here, and then to have a chance that it doesn't go off at all. Capital, you have to weigh your risk, right? If you are development capital.
But I'd like to take a step back, particularly in the housing front, because it's easy to say, well, look how smart everybody else is, and boy, I guess we're just stupid. But then you have to ask yourself, is that a reasonable explanation that California just doesn't know how to do and other places do? And I don't think that's the case. I think that what you have to do is take a step back and understand the incentives of our cities. One of the big issues in California is the fact that cities rely on sales taxes, they rely on gross receipts taxes to pay the bills. From the point of view of housing, because of Prop 13, gives particularly multifamily housing, workforce multifamily housing, they get almost no money from it. And yet the people who live in that type of housing tend to also represent the bulk of costs for many cities from the point of view of police and infrastructure and roads and utilities and this kind of thing. When you think about Texas and you ask, well, why does Texas build so much housing and we don't? Part of this boils down to the fact that in Texas, cities get a big hunk of their income from property taxes. They've incentivized cities to build. Here in California, our government doesn't want to recognize the power of incentives. Instead, the state just sits around and wags a finger and tells the cities how bad they are, and they never have a conversation about how do we change the playing field. So here's a basic suggestion I have for the state of California. As opposed to allocating sales taxes on the basis of where a big box store is located, why don't we allocate sales taxes on the basis of where people live? Right. Just take all the money and we give it to all the cities proportionate to the number of people who live there. Now, putting aside the fact that Beverly Hills and Santa Monica would collectively lose their minds over such a possibility, that would go a large step towards starting to re-incentivize cities to want people to want housing. Get to the heart of it. Stop with wagging the finger and change the incentives, because that's going to change how things get done.
So the next panel is going to cover this more, but just to kind of set them up, they'll have something to respond to. The state just recently passed some legislation that's supposed to encourage more building of housing, and specifically of affordable housing. Do you think it's going to do much?
Yeah. It's ridiculous.
I think I knew what the answer was going to be.
Look, again, first of all, they're not even defining the problem correctly. They continue to refer to this as an affordable housing crisis. It is not an affordable housing crisis. It's a housing supply crisis. If you say this is an affordable crisis and you try to build housing for low-income families, you're going to fail miserably. Housing markets don't build for low-income families. Housing markets have never built for low-income families. That's not how the market works. Richard and I had a long conversation about this not too long ago. It's called filtering. You build lots and lots in the middle and the upper end, and that will free up older housing stock for low-income families. If you don't build enough at the top, you're not going to have enough at the bottom, and that's what we're facing. This idea that for $500,000 a pop, you're going to build enough housing for the lower end of the housing need distribution is laughable.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's thinking that.
I agree.
I don't think anybody's thinking that.
Well, then they passed a bunch of bills, and they're not helping at all. They're not going to move.
So here's the issue. This time, look at that available capital and deploy it in a strategic way within the capital stack where it can do the most good. So instead of it being treated like every other dollar in the capital stack, it's receiving a commensurate return for where it's located, and hopefully that will allow a project that's right on the borderline of not being feasible to be delivered. That's what needs to happen. You can't treat that, in my opinion, you can't treat that dollar like every other dollar. Because you're right. You're not going to build your way out of whatever you want to call this at $400,000 a door. That's not going to work.
Well, I guess it depends on how you look at it. So the question is, do you see the market being constrained by costs? And I don't. I see the market being constrained by regulations. I see the problems being one of entitlements and zoning, not one of costs. I don't think there's a massive number of projects waiting to be built, but for, a 15% subsidy. Me personally, I don't see that. Now, maybe you're seeing it differently than I am.
I just don't think it's that simple.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that simple. I think it's a combination of cost and revenue.
So one question I have on that is, if you're building the supply, if there's the risk that in the short run it won't filter down, it takes a little time to filter, is there a role for focusing on affordability in the transition until there's enough units for those low-income folks? If, as you're saying, the new stuff that's coming online isn't going to house them.
But I agree, if you have a two-pronged approach. But there's no conversation about how do we just unleash new supply. How do you, because look, when you think about like LA City, which is doing much better, particularly in places like Hollywood and downtown, but understand that that's a few redevelopment zones within one massive city, which still isn't building anywhere close enough. And then look at a place like Glendale. Glendale hasn't expanded their housing stock in 2 decades. On net, the housing stock in Glendale hasn't changed in 2 decades. You cannot do this with 1 or 2 enlightened cities. You have to have a regional push for more housing. And there's too many cities out there that are going the exact opposite direction, and you're never going to get ahead of this. So unless you address what's happening at the top, which they're not doing, only focusing at the bottom, you're not going to move the needle.
Tax reform, property
tax reform, whatever the case may be.
State level.
Or you could go you can go Japan. And what Japan did was the national government just took the permitting process completely away from local government. Now that's really draconian, but again, that is a way of handling this. But you just can't rely on a few enlightened mayors to do what needs to be done.
So let's assume that nothing changes. We're faced with the situation that we have right now. Now, as we've said, some submarkets do better at this than others. And so I want to dive in a little bit deeper to some of the things that we were talking about and that Richard was talking about in the Casden forecast. There's a lot of big picture stuff happening here, but if you're an investor and you're looking at downtown Los Angeles where they're building, you're looking at other submarkets where they're not building, how do you decide how to project the future out? I mean, you break it down into some submarkets, I think people see in your report, Richard, but we can't quite get down to the neighborhood level with the data that we have here. Is there a way to do it?
Well, I'm not sure developers approach it that way, though. I think it's more like find the piece of dirt and then see what's possible with it, right? And then you decide, I mean, and I'm not a developer, maybe Paul knows better, but it seems like it's find the opportunity and decide if the opportunity pencils at the end of the day, right? Can they agree to the right land price? Can you build for that cost? Does it actually return your hurdle? I don't think it's as macro. You may want to be in coastal markets, but there's it's still a project by project, piece of land by piece of land opportunity for developers. And so I think, if developers get their hands on land in Santa Monica to build on, they probably would build in mass, but the city holds them at bay for years in that process, right? So that becomes opportunity cost becomes too high, and so you go where it's a little bit easier. You go downtown, but then downtown now has, 7,000 units delivering the next 2 years, so that's also not as feasible now because you have to wait to see what that supply does and to see if you can still, if it makes sense to build. You have to wait that timeline out and then evaluate it in a few years. It's just more dynamic than that, I think, at the end of the day, as everything is, though.
As everything is.
Yeah,
as everything is.
Do you see people getting pushed further and further out of the submarkets that would have been their first choice years ago?
Oh, yeah.
When you were talking about the filtering and building more housing on the upper end and then, people moving up and releasing lower stock, do you think that rent control is inhibiting that because you have people that are holding off from moving up to the next stock and releasing those units below that?
Absolutely. Rent control, yes, that's a very good point. In fact, we did a study not too long ago for the State Apartment Association. We looked at a number of rent control cities. You know, again, the funny thing about rent control is again, we have this debate, you know, does it work, does it not work? But sure, rent control holds rents down, but the question is that's not the question. The question is are you actually providing affordable housing for low-income families? We looked at a variety of markets that have pretty strong rent control in the state, and what we found for the most part is who gets helped in those markets are middle-income families, because they end up basically occupying stock that would typically be for lower-income families. You look at a place like Berkeley for all their claims of, oh, we're for low-income families, look at all our rent control, and then you look at Berkeley, and what you have is a bunch of middle to upper middle-income families living in the housing stock. In fact, you've seen a decline in the number of low-income families in Berkeley. So they're actually hurting the very people they're pretending to help as a result of this crazy rent control. So yes, that's yet again, it's a craziness. And you know, when we had the conversation about filtering, I went and looked at some of the data. You look at places like Dallas and Houston, where they build lots in the high end, and you clearly see a filtering process where low-income families predominantly live in older housing stock. Then you go to places in San Francisco, which doesn't build anything, and the majority of old housing stock is actually lived in by families making over $75,000 a year. So, you know, again, you build at the top to free up at the bottom. You don't build at the top, you're not going to have anything available at the bottom.
So Todd Saw and I at Wharton did a really nice paper some years ago looking at the income distribution in San Francisco right after World War II, and basically it mirrored the country as a whole. High income, middle income, low income, the percentages were the same. San Francisco is now a city for high income people and people in subsidized housing, and that's it. So, and it's a rent controlled city. So, there's one other factoid. This guy named Henry Polakowski who studied New York City rent control 20 years ago, and this gets to Chris's point, the average person in a rent controlled unit made more money than the average person in a non-rent controlled unit. So.
Wow.
I'm curious about your opinion on new deliveries. So buildings asking higher rents that are getting delivered into the market now, particularly with the amount of concessions out there, compared to your forecast to the overall market, which includes the cumulative multifamily housing stock.
So I'd like Paul's view on that since you're delivering.
Again, I'm not exactly sure I understand the question. I mean, there's no question there are concessions in the market relative to new product, whether it's semi-affordable market rate, and I don't mean affordable in the context of regulated, but whether it's market rate or luxury, there are concessions having to do with a whole set of other dynamics. But I'm not exactly sure I understand.
What we're curious is what's going to happen with all the new product that's being delivered, because it doesn't compare with rent-controlled product, and all the deliveries are brand new buildings that are asking $3-4 a foot rather than the rent-controlled buildings.
Well, look, I mean, people have two choices. You know, number one, they want to live in a particular submarket if they can. And number two, they want to live in a home that hopefully they think is going to make them happy and that they're comfortable living in. So older stock, and I know there's a tremendous amount of it in Los Angeles, tends to be of a lesser, not a lesser quality in as much as it just doesn't have available to it the things that people want to have in the community that they're living in today. So I think it's just a function of again, matching up what they can afford to pay and the location and, you know, the product.
So the vacancy rate for LA as a whole, we saw it was 4%. Do you think new supply will be around those same numbers for the higher rental buildings?
Well, we're delivering buildings in the downtown submarket right now, and the absorption that we're achieving is consistent with what we had assumed, which is pretty, I mean, like 30 homes a month, which is a lot.
You know, I think your point is, and it's a reasonable point, that the delivery of stock tends to be concentrated in a very specific niche in the market and in very specific locations. And in a sense, yes, those areas end up getting a little bit flooded. That niche of the market gets a little bit flooded. But in general, look, we're not building single family at all. We're building nothing on the lower end of the market at all. And the net result of that is that will get absorbed. The market will absorb that. It may be a little slower because we're pumping everything in one tiny part of the market, but the needs across the region are so dramatic that eventually you'll pick up. It's not a function of will that housing be filled. It absolutely will. Maybe you won't get exactly the aggressive numbers you were hoping for up front, but the general lack of housing in the entire region will ultimately mean everything that's built today will be occupied because we just don't have enough housing.
I mean, let's just do a little context setting here. There are roughly 1.8 million rental units in Los Angeles County. We're talking about delivery of 7,000 downtown. And for downtown, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
But in the context of the bigger market, that's what, 30 basis points?
Yeah.
Something like that?
Silly.
It's a pimple.
Yeah.
So that's my point about don't let your eyes deceive you. It appears like there's a building boom because when you drive down the 110, yeah, holy cow, that's a lot of cranes over there.
And nothing in Glendale.
But
you
leave, you leave in a few in Hollywood or something. But yeah, I mean, we have lots of places in LA County where there is no construction happening. And when I say no, I don't mean sort of in taking literary license sense of no. I mean no.
Yeah.
And you may see, especially in downtown, you may see the softness in the next few years. Concessions last longer than typical. They may not burn off in the first year. They may last 24 months. And so depending on your hold period, that can affect your cash flows. But I expect over the next 3 years, those concessions will go away and the market will tighten up again and people will start building in downtown again. I mean, it's just, there's nowhere else to build. And it'll have some natural filtering as well because the older stock in downtown LA will probably get compressed and they'll be a little more affordable. And the super class A stuff will kind of set the new bar and everything will kind of filter down as a result of that.
Okay, the best way to maximize your rents is for units to turn. When you build units, how do you think about that? Do you try and build units that are not designed for people to kind of stay and nest, for instance, any characteristics of the units, but how do you think about that?
There's an inflection point between retention and revenue growth, and Richard addressed it a little bit this morning relative to a home sitting vacant for a month. I mean, that's not a good thing. So I don't think. I think you've got to take into account a number of different dynamics to locate that inflection point relative to, he talked hypothetically about a 5% increase versus, I think you said, a 2% increase, and you don't have that home sitting vacant for a month. So I don't think it's a situation where people are consciously wanting to decrease retention with the idea that somehow they're going to receive, a dramatic growth in revenue.
But Paul, the units you guys are building today, aren't they targeted with the idea that people are renting more long-term?
Yes.
There's more amenities, there's more features, there are more homes than I think probably, they would have been 10 or 20 years ago when people were only in their 20s renting and moving on. So I think that's an element too. I think developers have adjusted that people are going to be long-term renters in our market where they haven't been historically.
I mean, I deliberately, and I get criticized for this. I mean, I call them homes. I don't call them apartments. They're homes. I mean, we're trying to deliver a community that people are going to want to live in. I mean, it happens to be a flat, and it could be located on a floor above the ground, but it's a home.
At the same time, we're seeing small units, things like no bathtubs.
Yes.
These other types of characteristics which would
but again, that gets back to this dynamic of the whole dollar rent and what people can afford. And unfortunately, since the Great Recession, in all the gateway cities on the West Coast and in New York and New Jersey, we've seen home sizes continue to be reduced because because we're pushing up against what's affordable relative to the whole dollar metric.
One last question over there.
Hi, hello. With the passage of Measure JJJ and real estate all being local and talking about these incentives, it's important to provide incentives, and we have a lack of providing housing for the lower end. How will the transit-oriented communities affordable housing overlay, what are the opportunity costs of the program, the guidelines, and then how do you see that impacting or influencing development in Los Angeles? So specifically, there's these new guidelines that were put in place like 2 weeks ago, and so I don't mean to bring it up so quickly. You haven't had time to really do the data, but just forecasting it, like just generally, what do you think the opportunities are, the impacts of this new overlay zone?
Well, I think very quickly we're going to find out, relatively quickly, we're going to find out. I mean, every time you increase density, which theoretically provides efficiencies in all kinds of different areas, but it also increased costs. So it's one thing to say, okay, great, you've got an opportunity here where you're going to build at 13-to-1 versus 7-to-1, but you're going to pay an incremental difference, obviously, to build at that density. And again, we're pushing up against whole dollar monthly metrics that people can afford or not.
I mean, one of the things the analogy that sometimes occurs to me here is, suppose people didn't have enough to eat. Would you start putting fees on farmers for growing crops and then try to use those fees to feed people? Or would you take a quarter of their plot away from them and say, this is the affordable food plot, and you don't get to charge people for the affordable food, but you're allowed to charge market rate for the remaining 3/4 of the plot. Is that how you would solve a problem with food?
Yeah.
Just ask.
That's a great analogy.
I think if you really care about housing, you have to do, and again, I don't think this is remotely a panacea. As I said, particularly in global cities, housing is just expensive, and so there's a role for subsidy, absolutely. But the idea that we're going to provide more housing by making housing more expensive to build, I can't wrap my head around that.
It gets worse than that. If you look at JJJ,
I thought that was pretty bad.
But the vast majority of the potential positives in JJJ can actually be nullified by the city. So most of the things, they have to do this unless the city decides otherwise. They have to do this unless the city does otherwise. The only thing that's guaranteed in JJJ is basically the prevailing wage rules. That's the only thing that is absolutely guaranteed in JJJ. JJJ is one of the, it was politically sheer genius and sheer evil, because they got Los Angeles residents where it counts. They got this idea that this is about affordable housing, and then you look at it, it's not at all about affordable housing. It's about giving prevailing wages to more construction workers. It's all it was about. And to Richard's point, it's just insanity that this is where we are going right now, and they're going to go another round. I've already heard we have JJJ #2 coming up. San Jose is talking about it. They're so excited. Squared. Exactly. JJ squared. They are so excited about their success on this. I guess that would be 9 J's. 9 J's. It's really scary, but that's where we're going.
I think that everybody in this, I think the vast majority of the people in this room consider Los Angeles their home. And I think the vast majority of the people in this room love the city. And people recognize the problem. And who knows if triple J or quadruple J solves the problem or doesn't. But I think what's most important is that everybody continues talking to each other and collaboratively trying to find a solution to the problem versus we're all just sitting in our car waiting to get on the freeway and there's some poor individual and there's hundreds of them, who doesn't have a home. And some way, somehow, we've got to get, we don't want to pay for mental health. That's clear. So instead of not paying for mental health, now we're going to try to provide someone a roof over their head so hopefully they can be rehabilitated and be productive. I mean, it's a big problem.
So we don't have to see him anymore.
I was going to say that's a good note to end on. You had to. Well, let me say that's a fitting note to end on from today.
Wow.
No, we have to move on. So I just want to thank our panel so much for sharing their insights.